3 days after my grandmother's funeral in Halifax, my older brother showed up at her waterfront cottage with a locksmith and 2 off-duty cops he had hired to throw me out onto the street. He did not know that I had already found the letter she had hidden inside the piano bench. He did not know what that letter contained, and he certainly did not know who I had called at 6 o'clock that morning. My name is Sienna. I am 34 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for one of the largest firms in Toronto. If your own family has ever tried to steal everything from you while smiling to your face, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe because you are going to want to hear exactly how one handwritten letter brought the entire house of cards crashing down on their heads. My grandmother Margaret passed away on a Tuesday in late October. She was 81 years old and she died peacefully in her sleep at the cottage on St. Margaret's Bay, the same cottage she and my grandfather Arthur had owned for over 50 years. My grandfather had passed 3 years earlier from a stroke, and my grandmother had spent her final years alone in that beautiful old house overlooking the Atlantic, tending her garden and playing her antique Steinway grand piano every single evening. The cottage was not some modest little cabin. My grandfather Arthur had been a highly successful mining engineer who had spent decades consulting for operations in Northern Ontario and British Columbia. He had quietly accumulated significant wealth, but he never flaunted it. The cottage on the bay was a sprawling 5-bedroom cedar and stone property sitting on 4 acres of oceanfront land. Conservative estimates placed it at around $4.5 million, but the real value of my grandparents' estate was not in the cottage itself. It was in the mineral rights, the investment portfolio, and the numbered company my grandfather had established decades ago. All told, the estate was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $22 million. I was the only grandchild who ever visited my grandmother after my grandfather died. My older brother Garrett lived in Vancouver and had not been home east in over 4 years. My sister Lydia lived in Montreal with her husband Curtis, a corporate real estate attorney who wore $3,000 suits and treated every family gathering like a hostile acquisition meeting. My mother Vivienne had remarried after my parents' divorce and now lived in a luxury condo in Yorkville. She visited my grandmother maybe twice a year, always around the holidays, always just long enough to hint about the will before catching her flight back to Toronto. I was the one who drove out to Halifax every single month. I was the one who sat with my grandmother through 2 hip replacements and held her hand when she cried about missing my grandfather. I was the one who fixed the leaking roof, winterized the pipes, and made sure she had groceries when the January storms buried the roads for days. None of that mattered to my family when the will was read. The reading took place at the law office of my grandmother's solicitor in downtown Halifax, 4 days after the funeral. The room was paneled in dark oak and smelled like old paper and furniture polish. My mother Vivienne sat at the head of the conference table wearing an all-black designer outfit and enormous sunglasses she refused to remove indoors. Garrett sat to her right, drumming his fingers on the table with the manic energy of a man who had already mentally spent his inheritance. Lydia and Curtis sat across from them. Curtis had brought his own leather portfolio and a Mont Blanc pen, as though he planned to start negotiating the moment the solicitor finished speaking. I sat at the far end of the table alone. The solicitor, a patient older gentleman named Mr. Beaulieu, opened the sealed document and began reading. The room was perfectly silent until he reached the key clause. My grandmother had left the entirety of the estate, the cottage, the investment accounts, the numbered company, and all mineral rights to a single beneficiary, me. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Garrett shoved his chair back from the table so hard it slammed into the wall behind him. "That is absolute garbage," he shouted, his face going dark red. "I am the oldest. I am the one who carries the family name. There is no way Grandma left everything to a glorified bookkeeper." Curtis was already on his feet, flipping through his portfolio as though he had a counter-argument prepared in advance. "This will is clearly the product of undue influence," Curtis declared, pointing his expensive pen at the solicitor. "Miss Campbell spent years isolating an elderly woman from her family. She manipulated a vulnerable senior into rewriting her estate documents. We will be filing a challenge with the Nova Scotia Supreme Court by end of business tomorrow." My mother removed her sunglasses and looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It was not grief. It was not shock. It was pure, calculated fury dressed up in a thin veil of maternal disappointment. "Sienna," my mother said, her voice trembling with manufactured sadness, Your grandmother was not thinking clearly in her final years, you know that. She was confused. She was lonely. A good daughter would do the right thing and distribute this estate equally among the family. That is what your grandfather would have wanted. I looked at each of them. My brother, who had not visited in 4 years. My sister, whose husband was already drafting legal threats. My mother, who had spent 2 decades treating my grandmother like an inconvenience she tolerated between shopping trips. I picked up my bag and stood. I did not argue. I did not cry. I told Mr. Beaulieu I would be in touch, and I walked out of that office without saying another word to any of them. That was a Wednesday. By Friday morning, they brought the ward directly to my grandmother's front door. I was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching the fog roll in off the bay when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Through the window, I saw a black Escalade and a white cargo van pulling up to the house. Garrett climbed out of the Escalade, wearing a leather jacket and an expression of smug superiority. Curtis stepped out behind him carrying a thick manila envelope. Lydia stayed in the passenger seat, filming the entire scene on her phone. 2 men I did not recognize got out of the van. One was carrying a heavy tool bag. The other had a clipboard and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. Garrett marched straight up to the front porch and banged on the door with his fist. "Time is up, Sienna," he yelled through the glass. "Curtis has a court order. You have 30 minutes to pack your stuff and get out of this house before we change every lock and have you charged with trespassing." I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. I was wearing a gray wool sweater and holding my coffee mug. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the manila envelope Curtis was holding and I looked at the locksmith standing behind him. "Let me see the order," I said. Curtis thrust the envelope at me with a sharp, aggressive motion. Inside was a document bearing what appeared to be a judicial stamp from the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. It was an interim order granting Garrett temporary control of the estate, pending a capacity hearing. It authorized immediate change of locks and removal of any unauthorized occupants. I read every line twice. As a forensic accountant, I had spent my entire career examining financial documents for discrepancies. I had testified in fraud cases involving tens of millions of dollars. I knew what a legitimate court order looked like, and I knew what a fabricated one looked like. The judicial stamp on the document was slightly too high and shifted about 2 millimeters to the left. The case number format did not match the standard Nova Scotia filing convention, and the name of the presiding justice was a judge who had retired 18 months ago. Curtis had forged a court order. I folded the document carefully and slid it back into the envelope. My heart rate did not change. My hands did not shake. I looked at my brother and his lawyer with the same clinical detachment I used when I was about to dismantle a fraudulent balance sheet in a courtroom. "This is a fake," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Garrett laughed, a harsh, forced sound. "You are delusional, Sienna. Curtis filed that order himself. It has a court stamp. You are not a lawyer. You do not get to decide what is real and what is not." Curtis crossed his arms and took a step closer to the door. "I suggest you start packing, Sienna, unless you want the RCMP to escort you off this property in front of the neighbors." I took a slow sip of my coffee. Then I said the words that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. "You should know that I found what Grandma left in the piano bench, and you should also know that I have already spoken to the CRA." The color drained out of Curtis's face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. Garrett's smug grin collapsed into something tight and panicked. He grabbed Curtis's arm and hissed something I could not quite hear, but the body language told me everything. They had not expected me to find the letter. Here is what my grandmother had hidden inside the piano bench. The night before the will reading, I had been sitting alone in the living room playing a few quiet chords on my grandmother's Steinway. The piano had not been tuned in over a year, and some of the keys stuck. When I lifted the bench seat to look for her old tuning tools, I found a thick brown envelope taped to the underside of the lid. It was sealed with red wax stamped with my grandfather's old signet ring. Written across the front in my grandmother's careful handwriting were 3 words: "For Sienna only." Inside the envelope were 3 things. The first was a handwritten letter from my grandmother dated just 6 weeks before she died. The second was a USB drive sealed in a small plastic case. And the third was a single business card with nothing on it except a phone number and the embossed crest of the Canada Revenue Agency, Criminal Investigations Division. The letter was 4 pages long, written in my grandmother's neat, precise script. It explained everything. My grandfather Arthur had always been meticulous about his finances. When he became too ill to manage the numbered company himself, he had entrusted the day-to-day operations to Garrett and Curtis. Curtis, as a licensed attorney, had been given signing authority over the corporate accounts. For 2 years, my grandfather trusted them. Then, 6 months before his stroke, he noticed discrepancies in the quarterly statements. Payments to vendors that did not exist, consulting fees to shell companies registered in the British Virgin Islands. My grandfather quietly hired a private forensic auditor to trace the money. What the auditor found was devastating. Curtis and Garrett had been systematically siphoning funds out of the numbered company through a network of fictitious invoicing. Over the course of 18 months, they had moved approximately $3.8 million into offshore accounts controlled by Curtis. They used the money to fund Garrett's failing tech startup in Vancouver and to finance Curtis and Lydia's lavish lifestyle in Montreal, including a $1.2 million condo they had purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds. My grandfather confronted Garrett privately. The conversation did not go well. Garrett denied everything, then threatened to have my grandfather declared mentally incompetent if he pursued the matter further. My grandfather, already weakened by his declining health, made a decision that haunted my grandmother for the rest of her life. He did not go to the authorities. Instead, he quietly changed the will, leaving everything to me, the only person in the family he trusted. He copied every financial record onto a USB drive and gave it to my grandmother with strict instructions. If the family ever tried to take the estate, give Sienna the envelope and let her do what I was too afraid to do. My grandfather died 3 months later. My grandmother kept the envelope hidden for 3 more years, waiting, hoping the family would simply accept the will and leave me in peace. When she realized they never would, she taped it to the piano bench and prayed I would find it before they could destroy the evidence. I spent the entire night before the will reading, plugged into my laptop with the USB drive, analyzing the financial data with the precision of someone who does this for a living. The trail was meticulous. My grandfather's auditor had documented everything: bank routing numbers, shell company registrations, forged signatures on corporate checks, wire transfer confirmations to offshore accounts in the BVI and the Cayman Islands. Curtis had been exceptionally arrogant. He had not even bothered to use encrypted communication. Several of his emails explicitly discussed how to move the money without triggering FinTrack reporting thresholds. At 6 o'clock the next morning, I called the number on the business card. The woman who answered identified herself only as a senior investigator with the CRA Criminal Investigations Division. When I told her my name and explained what I had found, there was a brief pause on the line. "Miss Sinclair," she said, her voice shifting from professional to intensely focused. "Your grandfather's auditor contacted our office 14 months ago. We have been building a parallel investigation into the numbered company since then, but we lacked the insider documentation to move forward. Can you confirm you have the original financial records?" "I have everything," I replied. "Every wire transfer, every forged invoice, every shell company registration. Do not leave that property," the investigator instructed, "and do not let anyone remove a single document from that house. We will have a team on site within 3 hours." So when Garrett and Curtis showed up with their fake court order and their locksmith, they were not just walking into a legal battle with their sister. They were walking into an active federal investigation. I stood on the porch and watched the realization hit Curtis like a physical blow. He was a corporate lawyer. He understood instantly what it meant when someone said the words Canada Revenue Agency and criminal investigation in the same sentence. This was not a civil family squabble anymore. This was a federal tax evasion and fraud case, and he had just shown up to the target property carrying a forged judicial order. "We need to leave," Curtis said, his voice suddenly low and tight. He grabbed Garrett's arm and tried to pull him toward the escalade. "Garrett, we need to leave right now." Garrett yanked his arm free. "What are you talking about? We are not leaving until she is out of this house. She is bluffing. She does not have anything." I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing. "Actually, Garrett, I do. I have the USB drive Grandpa made before he died. I have 2 years of forensic accounting records showing exactly how you and Curtis funneled $3.8 million out of the numbered company through fictitious invoices. I have the wire transfers to the offshore accounts in the BVI. I have Curtis's emails discussing how to structure the payments to avoid FinTrack reporting. And as of 6 o'clock this morning, the CRA Criminal Investigations Division has copies of everything." Garrett's face went white. Curtis dropped the manila envelope containing the forged court order. It hit the gravel and the papers scattered in the October wind. And that is when the black sedan pulled up the driveway. Two investigators in dark suits stepped out. One was the woman I had spoken to on the phone. The other was a tall man carrying a heavy briefcase bearing the crest of the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. Behind them, a marked RCMP vehicle rolled slowly through the gate and parked sideways across the driveway, blocking any exit. The lead investigator walked directly up to the porch, nodded at me, and then turned to face Curtis and Garrett. "Mr. Holloway," she said, addressing Curtis by name, "we have been aware of your involvement with the numbered company accounts for over a year. I strongly suggest you do not make any further statements without your own legal counsel present, and I would recommend that neither of you leave this province until we have completed our interviews." Curtis looked like he was going to be sick. Garrett started shouting, pointing at me, accusing me of fabricating evidence, of manipulating our grandmother, of orchestrating some kind of conspiracy. The RCMP officers stepped forward and asked him calmly to lower his voice, or he would be arrested for obstruction. Lydia scrambled out of the Escalade, still holding her phone. She looked at the RCMP car, then at the investigators, and her face crumpled into pure panic. "Curtis, what is happening?" she screamed. "Why are the police here? What did you do?" Curtis did not answer her. He just stood on the gravel driveway staring at the ground while his entire career and his freedom disintegrated around him. Within 48 hours, the CRA executed a full asset seizure order on every account connected to the numbered company. Every personal bank account belonging to Curtis and Garrett was frozen under the Proceeds of Crime Act. The $1.2 million Montreal condo was flagged for forfeiture. Garrett's tech startup in Vancouver, which had been funded entirely with embezzled money, was placed into receivership. The shell companies in the BVI were reported to international financial crime authorities. But the financial destruction was only the beginning. The forged court order Curtis had carried to my grandmother's cottage was submitted to the Nova Scotia Barristers' Society. A formal disciplinary hearing was initiated. Curtis was facing disbarment, criminal charges for forgery and fraud, and potential imprisonment. His legal career was finished. I thought it was over. I genuinely believed they would retreat, hire their own lawyers, and quietly try to negotiate their way out of the catastrophe they had created. I underestimated my mother. 3 weeks after the CRA seizure, I received a phone call from my youngest sister, Hazel. She was 26 years old, lived in Ottawa with her partner Nolan, and had deliberately stayed out of the family conflict. Hazel was quiet, gentle, and had spent her whole life trying to avoid our mother's toxic manipulations. She called me at 11 o'clock at night, crying so hard she could barely speak. "Sienna," she whispered. "Mom came to my apartment today. She wants me to sign something. She says if I do not sign it, she will tell Nolan's employer that he has a criminal record." "He does not have a criminal record, Sienna. She is making it up. But Nolan just started his new position at the engineering firm, and if she calls them with false accusations, it could his career before it even begins." "What does she want you to sign?" I asked, my voice perfectly steady even as my blood turned to ice. "It is a sworn affidavit. It says you have been mentally unstable since you were a teenager. It says you have a history of paranoid delusions and financial irresponsibility. She says if I sign it, she can get a court to appoint her as your legal guardian and take control of the estate. She says it is the only way to save Garrett from going to prison." I closed my eyes. My mother was attempting to have me declared mentally incompetent through a fabricated affidavit supported by coerced testimony from my own sister. She was willing to blackmail Hazel's partner and destroy his career just to gain control of the $22 million estate she believed she was entitled to. "Do not sign anything," I told Hazel. "Record every conversation you have with Mom from this point forward. I am going to handle this." The next morning I sat in the office of my litigation attorney in downtown Toronto. Her name was Miss Tremblay, and she was the most methodical, relentless legal mind I had ever worked with. When I played her the recording Hazel had made of our mother's threats, Miss Tremblay's expression shifted from professional concern to cold, surgical fury. Extortion, witness tampering, and attempting to procure a false affidavit, Miss Tremblay listed, making precise notes on her legal pad. "Your mother just committed 3 separate criminal code offenses in a single conversation. The recording is admissible in Ontario as single-party consent. I want this filed with the Crown Prosecutor by end of day." But I knew that reactive defense was not enough. My mother would keep coming. She would find another shady lawyer, another family member to pressure, another angle of attack. I needed to eliminate her ability to ever challenge my competency again. I voluntarily submitted myself to 3 independent psychiatric evaluations conducted by board-certified forensic psychiatrists. Over the course of 2 days, I completed extensive cognitive testing, clinical interviews, and behavioral assessments. All 3 psychiatrists independently concluded that I demonstrated superior analytical reasoning, exceptional emotional regulation, and 0 indicators of any psychiatric disorder. One evaluator specifically noted that my capacity to manage complex financial instruments under extreme familial stress was in the 98th percentile. I compiled the 3 psychiatric reports, the audio recording of my mother's extortion attempt, the forged court order Curtis had used, and the complete forensic accounting dossier into a single-bound legal filing. Ms. Tremblay submitted it simultaneously to the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, the Ontario Superior Court, and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. The response was swift and devastating. A Superior Court justice in Ontario issued an emergency order permanently barring my mother from filing any guardianship, conservatorship, or capacity challenge against me in any Canadian jurisdiction. The order specifically cited the psychiatric evaluations and the documented pattern of harassment and extortion as grounds for the blanket prohibition. The Crown prosecutor in Ottawa opened a formal investigation into my mother's attempt to procure a false affidavit through blackmail. Vivienne was served with a criminal summons at her Yorkville condo. She was charged with extortion, intimidation of a witness, and attempting to obstruct justice. Garrett was formally charged with fraud over $5,000, conspiracy to commit fraud, and tax evasion under the Income Tax Act. Curtis was charged with the same offenses plus forgery, uttering a forged document, and professional misconduct. Both were denied bail due to flight risk, given their documented access to offshore accounts. Lydia, who had stood by and filmed the attempted eviction while fully aware of her husband's financial crimes, was charged as an accessory. My mother's arrest was the moment the last thread of the family delusion finally snapped. She was photographed being led out of her luxury condo building in handcuffs, her designer coat thrown over her wrists in a futile attempt to hide the restraints from the waiting cameras. A neighbor had tipped off the local press. The image ran on the front page of the Toronto Star the next morning. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my grandmother's cottage, looking out at the same view of St. Margaret's Bay that she had loved for half a century. The October fog was rolling in off the Atlantic, soft and gray and impossibly peaceful. The cottage had been fully renovated. I had replaced the old cedar shingles, installed a new heating system, and had the Steinway professionally restored. It sounded beautiful again. Garrett received a 7-year federal sentence. Curtis received 9 years, plus permanent disbarment. Lydia received 3 years of supervised probation and a lifetime ban from holding any corporate directorship. My mother received a 4-year sentence for extortion and obstruction. The Yorkville condo was seized and sold to cover her legal costs. The Montreal condo purchased with embezzled funds was forfeited to the Crown. Hazel and Nolan drove down from Ottawa for the weekend. They pulled into the gravel driveway in their modest Subaru, and Hazel stepped out into the cool salt air with a look of absolute peace on her face. She had finally stopped flinching every time her phone rang. Nolan carried a bag of groceries into the kitchen while Hazel and I sat on the back porch watching the tide come in. Nolan was a good man. He was steady, principled, and he had stood by Hazel through the ugliest chapter of her life without once trying to use the situation for personal gain. My grandfather would have respected him enormously. "How are you doing?" Hazel asked, wrapping her hands around her tea mug. I thought about the question carefully. For the first time in a very long time, I did not have to perform composure. I did not have to maintain the clinical detachment that had carried me through the investigation, the court proceedings, and the systematic dismantling of the family that had tried to destroy me. "I am building something," I told her. And I was. Using the estate funds, I had established the Arthur and Margaret Sinclair Foundation, a charitable trust providing financial literacy resources, forensic accounting scholarships, and emergency legal aid to people escaping financial abuse by family members. The foundation operated out of a small office in Halifax, but we had already funded 14 cases across 4 provinces, helping individuals recover assets stolen by parents, siblings, and spouses who believed that blood entitled them to take whatever they wanted. 6 weeks after the foundation launch, I received one final visit. I was in the cottage reviewing a grant application when the security camera chimed. I looked at the monitor and felt a strange, hollow stillness settle over me. My mother was standing at the gate. She had been released on parole after serving 18 months of her sentence. She looked nothing like the woman who had once commanded every room she entered. She was thin, pale, wearing a plain dark coat that did not fit properly. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no color, no styling. She stood at the gate with her hands folded in front of her, not banging, not shouting, just standing there in the cold drizzle, waiting. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. She looked up at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Sienna," she said. Her voice was small and rough, nothing like the polished instrument she used to wield like a weapon. "I know I do not have any right to be here. I know what I did. I am not going to ask you for money. I am not going to ask you to forgive me. I just needed to see that you were all right. And I needed to tell you that your grandmother was right about you. She was always right about you." I studied her face. I looked for the calculation, the theatrical setup, the pivot toward manipulation. I did not find it. What I found instead was a broken woman standing in the rain outside a house she would never be allowed to enter again. I did not invite her in. I did not offer her tea or a warm towel or a ride back to the bus stop. I did not feel cruelty and I did not feel mercy. I felt the same profound, settled clarity that had guided me through every decision since the night I found the envelope in the piano bench. "You are right that Grandma was right about me," I said. "She knew I would not let them take what was not theirs. She knew I would protect it." My mother nodded slowly. A single tear ran down her cheek, and for once I believed it was real. "Take care of yourself, Vivienne," I said. I used her first name deliberately. She was not my mother anymore. She was a woman I used to know. She turned and walked back down the gravel driveway toward the road. I watched her until she disappeared around the bend, a small gray figure swallowed by the fog rolling in off the Atlantic. I went back inside and closed the door. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sound that echoed through the quiet house. I sat down at my grandmother's piano and played the first few bars of the nocturne she used to love, the one she played every evening while the sun set over the bay. The restored Steinway filled the cottage with warm, resonant sound. Through the window, the fog settled over St. Margaret's Bay like a soft wool blanket, and the ocean kept its steady rhythm against the rocks below. I was home, and no one was ever going to take it from me again. The greatest lesson my grandmother taught me was not about money or revenge. It was about knowing your own worth when the people closest to you refuse to see it. Walking away from family is not a failure. It is the most powerful act of self-preservation you will ever perform. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous one, not because they are plotting, but because they have already finished. Please share exactly how you set your own boundaries with people who mistook your kindness for weakness, and drop your answer in the comments below.